Hello, I'm not sure whether I say good morning, good afternoon, and I'm still on very strange time scale. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk here. So as some of you can or saw last night, I'm having a wonderful time. Didn't just come here for my dancing abilities, so I'm going to show you as well that I know a bit more. Okay, so we've heard quite a lot this morning about breakfast, questions arising, what type of breakfast is optimal. For children, we looked at macronutrient protein in terms of muscle and growth. And what I'm going to focus on now for the last part of this session is the brain. So the brain is basically that thing between our ears, and it's important for our cognition. Now, traditionally, when we thought about nutrition and optimal nutrition, we were very much focused on general health aspects. So in children, optimal growth, but also in later life, we looked at cardiovascular health and all these aspects. Now, more recently, we have turned our attention towards cognitive performance as well. Now, we've heard a lot this morning that breakfast is recommended as part of a healthy diet because it's associated to a certain extent with healthier macro and micronutrient intake. But breakfast has now also been promoted in terms of improving, and I think the concept of improving isn't correct. It's about sustaining cognitive performance in children, particularly in the morning. Now, when we think about the main macronutrients required for children, we already know this. We have the fats, we have the proteins, and we have the carbohydrates. What I'm going to focus on in terms of trying to identify the types of breakfasts that are optimal for cognitive performance in children, but also in the general population, is really the postprandial glycemic response. So we will come across the concept of glycemic index, we will come across the concept of glycemic load, but I'm not focusing on glycemic index foods as such. We're looking at the general breakfast intervention and what this does to our blood glucose levels. Now, glucose is interesting because we heard that already yesterday in Christiane Henry's talk. The brain is a fuel guzzler. So it needs a lot of energy. It needs it to sustain neural activity, and it needs glucose and oxygen. These are basically the main drivers to sustain the energetic metabolism in the brain. Compared to other organs, as I said, the brain is very greedy. It wants a lot of that glucose and oxygen. Our body is very clever, so even in periods of fasting, and we talked about intermittent fasting, somebody just mentioned the fasting during religious festivals or interventions, the brain, oh, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong, there we go. Sorry, I can see both slides, and I thought you saw the second one. You didn't. So the body is quite clever to make sure we keep our blood glucose levels relatively stable. So in periods of fasting, we will have the breakdown of glucose that has been previously stored to maintain glucose levels. When we take in foods, we know there is an insulinic response towards protein, but particularly towards carbohydrates. Insulin is then released from the pancreas to make sure that the body can actually use that glucose. Without insulin, the glucose is just floating about in the bloodstream and won't be able to actually be accessed by the cells. Now, when we think about the journey into the brain, so we have our breakfast, we have our food, we have an insulinic response, insulin goes up, and then blood glucose is basically taken into the bloodstream, and it crosses the blood-brain barrier, and it gets into there via active carrier mechanisms. And then once we have it in the brain, as we can see here, the axis is mediated by glucose transporters. There's a variety of glucose transporters that are there that have been identified. And I think what is important to note here is that whereas in the periphery we're very well equipped to store glucose for future use, the brain isn't very good for storage of glucose. So we have astroglia where we store small amounts for later release, but that's relatively little compared to what's happened in the periphery. And that's quite an important concept when we start thinking about fluctuations in glucose levels centrally and how this might affect cognitive performance. Glucose is important for the generation of energy. So, as I said before, neuronal activity needs a lot of energy. So part of the role of glucose is to provide the generation of the energy. The energy currency the brain or the body uses is adenosine triphosphate, and glucose helps us generate that activity. Now, interesting, as I said before, our brain is a very greedy organ when it comes to energy needs, but these energy needs actually change across the lifespan. And what is interesting for this symposium, where we look at infants and young children, is that this is exactly the population where the energy needs in the brain are particularly high. So we have a high rate of glucose utilization, which also coincides with a time where the child has to do a lot of learning processes, growing processes. During that period, glucose needs to be particularly stable in order to sustain and maintain these processes. Why do we have this increased activity? We can always see it in terms of the periphery and the growth you were referring to yesterday. But when we look at the brain is basically fine-tuning at that stage. We're building new connections in the brain, new synapses. We might lose some of the synapses. So we have very energetically demanding processes going on, particularly in these early stages of development. So that already shows us that the energy supply at that age might have to be should be particularly stable. We also have a longer sleeping period, and Teresa mentioned that before in her talk, which in children might be a greater metabolic burden in terms of the need of more of the generation of higher energy needs and supplies. So this overnight fast might actually be a greater metabolic burden compared to adults. So breakfast consumption might actually be vital to provide sufficient energy for the child to perform optimally. And like I said, I'm not talking about a magic bullet in making all the kids really smart. It's about sustaining performance across the morning. When we look at the literature, and again, this is something Teresa mentioned, it's not very clear-cut whether breakfast is actually beneficial. Okay, so we find some studies where there seems to be some evidence, but there's also a lot of studies that show no effect, such as the one you just mentioned. The problem partly is as well that there is a lack of acute intervention studies that actually tries to assess what type of breakfast is optimal for cognitive performance in children. So if we don't find effects in certain studies, that might simply be that it's the type of breakfast is not optimal for maintaining cognitive performance. Now, when we look, and again, I'm looking at the effects in terms of glycemic response and looking at studies that assessed glycemic response. What we find is that obviously there's some evidence that suggests that a lower postprandial glycemic response is beneficial to cognitive performance in children across the morning, but others found no such effect. Now, an example I'm showing you here is that, so this would be the expected glycemic response to a high and a low GI food. So obviously what we would see is that we have a quick response in glucose levels and then a relatively steep fall for a high glycemic index intervention, whereas a low glycemic intervention, we would have less of an increase and a less sharp decline. You can't see that here that well, but you see in other more different conditions where we have, particularly with high glycemic foods, where actually we, after a time, go below baseline. Now, this is a study by Westness et al., one of the first ones looking at different kind of glycemic intervention. They had glucose as a kind of high glycemic index food, and they had Cheerios, and they had Shreddies. And they found that the lower GI breakfast seemed to be somewhat protective against the cognitive decline in the morning. And that's, again, it's an important point to mention. So we're not talking about an improvement. We're talking about protecting children against the decline in the morning. And what we can see here as well, and that's interesting to note in relation to these studies which don't find an effect, that the high glycemic index intervention actually wasn't superior to having no breakfast. Okay, so again, we need to look at what kind of breakfast might help in terms of stabilizing performance. Sorry. So basically, when we think about the glycemic response, is that we're looking at a model response. So the idea would be, well, a high glycemic index food is potentially beneficial early on. That's because we have a boost in glucose availability that might help particular memory functioning, maybe attention as well. But then across the mornings, because blood glucose levels decline, performance declines. What we have with foods that have a lower glycemic index, we don't have that immediate boost, but what we have is we have a steady performance across the morning because we keep the energy supply stable. So the assumption would be that, well, we have a product, we see the glycemic response, we have a certain task, and then we see differences in performance. So if we have any manipulations in terms of glycemic response, it should be fairly straightforward. Products with a lower glycemic response are better. Products with a higher glycemic response are not so good. However, what's actually going on is this picture. And that explains why showing effects, particular cognitive effects, in following nutritional intervention, it's a very difficult thing to do. The effects are subtle, and the effects are influenced by a lot of other systemic responses in the body. Now, when we look at the effects, we think about, drug effects, which are as well, these have often a much more defined way of mechanism, but still we see a lot of inter-individual variability. Now, with nutrition, we don't necessarily have all the knowledge in terms of the defined underlying mechanism, so we can, we know that the systemic responses might be very different, so it's much more difficult to actually demonstrate these effects. So when we look at the individual factors, so there are inter-individual differences in the child in terms of their level of arousal, how activated, how excited are they by taking part in this study. And this will affect cognitive performance and even glycemic response. We look at the task domain, we look at the task difficulty, something I'm going to mention again. It's very difficult actually to choose the right task for these nutritional interventions, because when we look at neuropsychological tests, they're often used to distinguish normotypical children from those who are not developing normally. but they might not have the sensitivity to actually detect these subtle differences in a population that works already at an optimal level. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to just talk you through some of these factors that needs to be taken into account when we do these studies. So the methodological considerations. So the cognitive assessment, it needs to be hypothesis-driven. We need to have an understanding in terms of, well, which aspects of cognition do we actually want to target. There are specific domains, and we need to also think about that, are these tasks appropriate to our target population? An interesting point that that was mentioned before in terms of the practice effects, baseline effects. Ideally, what we do is we establish a stable baseline. So we expose participants to these tests before, so they're already working at a certain baseline, and then we have these different parallel tests in order to tease effects apart in these kind of crossover designs or repeated measures designs. We need to think about the location as well, and we need to think about which macronutrient, which specific intervention we're using is likely to affect which area of the brain. Now, in terms of the postprandial response in glucose, there are two areas that are particularly of interest, and one of them is the frontal lobe. I mentioned the frontal lobe, I think the other, was it 2 days ago, where there was a question about frontal lobe self-regulation. So the frontal lobe is one of these areas of the brain that in terms of evolutionary processes develop very late, but also in our own development, it develops very late in life. So by the age of 24, hopefully we have a kind of, fully functioning frontal lobe. So before the age of 24, you have a very good excuse, not to be able to control yourself. And these areas of the brain are also, there is some evidence to suggest that this area of the brain is particularly sensitive to these glucose fluctuations and might also be more energy greedy in terms of fully functioning. There's another area of the brain, that's the medial temporal lobe area, the hippocampus, and we do know that this is an area pertaining to particular memory performance that also seems to be quite susceptible to these fluctuations. So we need to know our areas, and we need to know the tests that pertain to function of these areas in order to potentially see beneficial or non-beneficial effects. The recent reviews that have been done in terms of looking at the effects of breakfast, in particular, I'm looking at it from the postprandial response, show that attention, executive function skills, and memory are most likely to be improved by breakfast administration and glycemic response manipulations. And again, this nicely shows these are these areas we have been talking about, frontal lobe and medial temporal lobe. Again, the results seem to suggest at that point that a lower GI breakfast may be protective against this decline in memory and attention throughout the morning. But there's a clear need, again, for studies using cognitive tasks that are sufficiently sensitive to nutritional manipulations in order for us to actually be able to make any recommendations about this is the kind of breakfast that will help with cognitive performance in children. The other issue we need to think about in general in nutritional intervention studies when we look at cognition is the design. So we talked about the advantage of a within subject design where the subject gets all, or the child gets all the different treatments. We have also designs where each child is just assigned to one specific treatment. In any case, we need to think about the potential confounders, so like order effects. We need to control for order effects. Teresa's study is a good example where these order effects were controlled for. We need to think about familiarization, as I said before, in order to kind of make sure children are starting at a similar baseline in order to then find effects that are due merely to nutrition. Another issue we have with nutrition is what's the optimal window of opportunity to find effects. So some studies might not have found effects in terms of cognition simply because they did not assess cognitive performance at the time frame when there might be effects observable. And one of these is particularly in the postprandial response. When we look at glycemic response, it seems to be towards later in the morning where these effects become evident. And we need to think about as well that there needs to be a sufficient sensitivity in the tests we use towards nutritional manipulations. Another aspect that has very often been neglected at it, but is becoming more and more interesting, and again it leads into the idea of self-regulation. Now, self-regulation is a concept that we talk about in terms of food intake, but self-regulation is an important aspect to all aspects of life and cognitive performance as well. When we think about our children, and when we think about our children's memory performance, now if there's an impairment in memory or if they can't remember things, it's not because they have some kind of hippocampal damage that's going on. No, it's because they don't pay attention and because they might be all over the place. And you probably hear yourself saying, would you just listen to me for a moment. And what school teachers find as well is that if you have a classroom of children that can't self-regulate, and that self-regulation is about making sure when I'm getting very excited, I can calm myself down a bit. And it's this calming myself down, and then I can pay attention, and then I can learn. And this self-regulation, the center of self-regulation, or what we know about self-regulation, is very much frontal lobe driven. So what we need to do as well is we need to look at nutritional interventions and how potentially they affect this ability to self-regulate. And we do know that increased activation actually also affects glycemic response. That goes back to a very important mechanism in terms of stress. So when I'm stressed, and that would be a quite immense measure of activation, my body prepares for that stressor. And it does so by a release of glucose. That glucose helps me to run away or to fight the stressor, but it also translates to an increased glucose supply to the brain, because what it will help me is would help me remember the situation. Remember, when I go out there might be a tiger, so best not go there again. Don't worry, there's not a tiger, I just made that up. So again, we need to think about the neuroenergetic, the status of the children in terms of arousal, and also how our intervention can manipulate that arousal to get the optimal level for children for learning. Conceptual and methodological considerations as well is study location, and that feeds into the concept of arousal. As you said, you're doing studies in the clinical facilities. We have done that as well. So we need to kind of familiarize the kids with it, because otherwise, I've seen it in my own studies before, we might have the first day very excited kids running around, or very timid kids because they don't know the hospital environment. So make sure we're all kind of at a stable and comfortable place, because this will affect cognitive performance, and this might mask any nutritional effects we might find. It also affects hormonal status. We need to think about the participant, we need to think about breakfast habits, and that was the question that came before. There's evidence to suggest that children who don't regularly have breakfast will be affected differently in terms of breakfast interventions. So it's not to say we don't necessarily have to exclude them, but we have to control for that in our statistical analysis. Socioeconomic status is the same, and we need to think about sample size. Teresa mentioned a study with a very good sample size, but a lot of the nutritional studies are notoriously underpowered. So we can't actually say necessarily there's no effect because the sample size might not have been sufficient. But that's also a problem because we don't have enough data to calculate appropriate effect sizes. So we also have an issue in terms of the glycemic response itself. So glycemic index is a big issue at the moment. Everybody talks about glycemic index. Don't have a high glycemic index food, don't have low glycemic index food because this doesn't that. First of all, I want to say one thing, the food itself in isolation, you usually don't consume it in isolation. And as Leonidas pointed out, there are loads of other macronutrients that will actually affect the glycemic response to a certain food. So just because the food itself is a high glycemic index food, the moment you put some butter on it, the moment you put some cheese on it, the glycemic response will actually be quite different. So we have to, I think, stop going away from the notion of this is a bad food itself because it has a high glycemic index. As long as we eat it with other food constituents, it will change. But few studies have actually looked at that concept of glycemic response in children. We know adults react so-and-so to these high glycemic index intervention, low glycemic intervention. We don't really have an idea what happens with children. So there have been a few studies now looking at that, but we really need to have much more knowledge in terms of the metabolic responses and the responses of children towards different glycemic intervention. I'm showing you this picture here now in terms of the glycemic response. We do know that glycemic response is heavily influenced by the certain homeostatic mechanisms. We do know that there's a period, for example, in puberty, teenage years, where we have quite dramatic changes to the glucose response. But we don't know much about the younger children, okay? So we need to find more data here. Now, the advantage is that we now have some glucose monitors that actually can give us the continuous glucose monitors that are relatively non-invasive, that can show us a good picture in terms of the glycemic response. We don't really want to stop children repeatedly across the day. Those sensors allow us to get a good profile without having to repeatedly stop and collect blood from the children. Another interesting point, and I think that's something Teresa showed, we need to think about the second meal effect. So our glycemic response changes. Your glycemic response towards your breakfast depends on what you had as well in the evening before. So we need to make sure that if we want to look at glycemic response, we have to give standardized evening meals, and that's something you did as well. Palatability, and that's another issue, and that's an issue that came across in other ways as well. It's no good as making recommendation in terms of that's the optimal food you have to ingest in order to be healthy if it doesn't taste nice. And the palatability will also affect our glycemic response. So we need to make sure that in the interventions, when we're trying to look at the effects of glycemic response, that these interventions actually taste nice, because otherwise we won't get the right picture. So to summarize, the current reviews that are available really only present a preliminary view of the data. There is an urgent need to have more studies that look at the effects of different breakfast on cognitive performance. But because the brain needs glucose in order to function properly, because children have these higher energetic needs in glucose, the postprandial response is actually a very good contender when we want to look at cognitive performance across the morning in particular. It's likely to affect cognitive performance even in healthy children, but it's very difficult to assess for all the various methodological reasons I mentioned before. When we look at the chronic effects, then, and we look at children in terms of malnourished children, healthy children, then I think these breakfast effects, I mean, for malnourished children, cognition is one issue as well. It's maybe not their primarily issue. You have other health issues that are more pressing, but you then look as well in terms of educational attainment, which is an important aspect for these children. It seems that low socioeconomic status and malnourished children are more susceptible to these interventions, potentially because they're starting at a lower baseline. Depending on the degree of malnourishment, we might not see effect because of the kind of structural impairments that are in place, and that we need more chronic interventions in order to find effects. I think in conclusion, it has nutritional intervention, and looking at glycemic response specifically, has the potential for optimizing cognitive performance across the lifespan. We need to really carefully think about the design of our studies in order to assess that further. And in general, and this is in terms of the glycemic response as well, it seems that conditions or nutritional recommendations that reduce the allostatic load on the body might be actually optimal in terms of the health outcomes, both immediate but also in the long term. Nutrition, I think that's something similar to what you showed before. What we have the opportunity here is that if we start intervening at an early age, if we start looking at optimal nutrition at an early age, and I'm talking from a cognitive perspective, but we can look at that across the general health outcome, is really that what we do at early age will affect what happens in terms of the health outcomes at later age. What we can do is at different stages of the lifespan, these effects will have different outcomes. So in early life, we look at optimal growth and development. In adult life, we're ensuring highest possible level of functioning. But old age is another important aspect as well. And here, glycemic response is, glycemia and insulinemia is very important as well. That's about maintaining the highest possible level of functioning and also preventing disease. And I'll leave you with this picture, which shows that we do know, for example, I mean, we have a lot of global challenges to deal with that can be tackled with nutrition. We talk about obesity, we talk about malnutrition, we talk about deficiencies, but one of the global issues as well is dementia. And we do know that impaired glucose regulatory mechanisms are one of the risk factors that might actually lead to the development of dementia. It's one of them. It doesn't mean that if you're diabetic, you'll get Alzheimer's disease, but it also provides an opportunity to have targeted intervention where we can actually do something. And we know it's difficult to elicit behavior change. So that is one of the other challenges. Even once we know what is the optimal food, then we have to really start thinking about the behavior change. I mean, Mike mentioned about the kind of digital age and how this can be then done. So I'll thank you very much. I'll leave it there just to acknowledge some of the collaborators and postdocs and also some of the funding I received. And thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy and hopefully I can answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sandra. I'm sure you still have a lot of blood sugar circulating for you to ask questions. Dr. Ford.
Hi, Sandra. Thank you. That was a fantastic presentation. I have a question about, you talked about the variability in glycemic index of individual foods. But have you looked also at the variability of the glycemic index or the glycemic response of individual people? I'm thinking specifically of differences between ethnicities, where Asians, for example, have a different glycemic response than Caucasians. Ethnic differences, for example.
Well, we haven't done that in our lab, but and I can't give you the exact details in terms of what we have, but I think again here the difference is that we need to think about their habitual diet, which then changes their glycemic response to acute interventions. So these things are not independent. So I know we have incidence rate of certain metabolic diseases are lower in certain countries because of their diets. In other countries now they're quickly picking up again, but I can't give you an exact answer to that one.
Even within a single ethnicity then, one of the largest explanations for variation is in the quality of the bolus it swallows, so chewing again. Have you ever looked at the glycemic response of individual children, for example, who chew extensively or chew very quickly?
No, we haven't. That would be very interesting, yeah.
Thank you very much for this very clear presentation, in addition to your dancing abilities, I would say. I have one comment and one question. So the comment is really, in the life history of this type of research, isn't it time to set up guidelines to really define which type of cognitive task could be used to assess specific hypotheses? Because I think your point was very clear about that it needs to be hypothesis driven, but there are really a myriad of cognitive tasks out, and they are all applied in different ways. So if we want to compare outcomes and methods, maybe we need guidelines also about what should be used and applied in certain situations. So I guess that I think that would help a lot.
Yeah.
And then my question is, so you mentioned acute effect of nutrition on cognitive function, or how it could be assessed, and my question really relates to chronic effect of nutrition on cognitive performance, and in particular on the effect of omega-3 on cognitive function in children. So do you have any thing to say about that?
Well, there have been some studies. I mean, I don't do the omega-3, so that's the other fraction, but I think some of the studies which have received quite a lot of attention, when you start looking at them, they actually fall short in terms of some of the aspects, the way they're designed. I mean, I think some of the earlier studies in particular, they didn't have a control group. So you give children a supplement, you give them a lot of attention, you test them across, repeatedly, and wow, they improve their performance. But if you don't have a placebo control, then that doesn't really say anything. In terms of supplementation, I have looked more in adult populations rather than children. I think supplementation, if we talk about supplementation, then it's an issue of where you have defined deficiencies. Otherwise, there shouldn't be supplementation just because you read in a study that it improves cognitive function. That's not to say that these essential fatty acids aren't important for cognitive function, myelization, and neuronal development. But again, we need to find out, okay, what's the optimal rate, how much is in the habitual diet, and in general steer away from any supplementation where it's not necessary.
Dr. Gibney, and then Dr. Henry, and then Dr. Karagunis.
Okay, I just wanted to follow up on Kieran Ford's question about the variability in the glycemic response. And it always looks beautiful when we look at glucose rising and glucose falling. But the reality is that there's massive variation in that. And if you do repeated studies and then do within and between person variation, well, certainly our work, we showed 4 completely different clusters of postprandial glycemic response to a standardized test made under very strict clinical conditions. And so, I mean, we were at it from a completely different angle. But the problem is there isn't one single glycemic response. There are patterns, and some people don't show the response until late in the morning. Some people show it immediately. Some people are almost flat. And why that is, I don't know. It may have something to do with prior meals the night before. It might have, I don't know why, but
Yeah.
it's a hard thing to control for. I pity you. Well, not I pity you, but I have sympathy for you.
No,
So
I fully agree, and I think we will be probably surprised that the inter-individual variability in children will be even higher than in some adults. And then I've done most of my studies looking at young, healthy adults, and we find great inter-individual variability, but also intra-individual variability. So it's a very complex issue, and like I said before, you know, the meal you had before, how much you like the food, how excited you are, in what state of mind you are in a certain situations, all this affects your glycemic response. So it's a very messy, you know, outcome measure, if you like. So what we can look at is trends, I think. That's the best thing to do, is to look at trends and to see, you know, if we have a food that, you know, is supposedly high glycemic index. I don't really like the concept that much, but, you know, then we have a trend towards this peak and then a fall, whereas with low glycemic, we have this more trending towards a flatter line. That's, I think, the best we can say. And also, I think we should go away from the notion of, say, correlation of blood glucose levels at certain points and how this affects cognitive performance, because, like you said, there's such great inter-individuality. We can only look at the trends.
Dr. Henry?
Hi, Sandra. I think you made a very convincing argument why one should look at glucose homeostasis, because the brain is using so much of energy as a source of glucose, etc. But if I remember right, many years ago, Ernest Pollitt showed very powerful effects of simply supplementing children with iron, having profound effects on cognitive enhancement. Any comment on how we could reconcile that? Because one of my concerns is that putting all the eggs in one basket of glucose homeostasis, are we kind of missing perhaps some other paradigms?
Oh no, that's not the point I would want to make anyway. I mean, it's just, here we're looking at one aspect. And I think in order to get a picture of which kind of macro and micronutrients affect cognitive performance, we need to assess them first in isolation, and then look at the combined and potentially synergistic effects as well. So it's not about saying, this is the way forward, this is the only thing we should concentrate on. I think where it's an important aspect is as well when we then look across the lifespan, when we look about the incidence of metabolic diseases, the incidence of obesity, the incidence of diabetes, where we know that this actually has negative impact on cognitive performance. So to kind of come up with nutritional recommendations that in the short term affect cognitive performance, but also are good for the long term. I think that's where the carbohydrates, the glycemic response focus becomes apparent and is important, but it's not to say that there are other macro and micronutrients that aren't important as well.
Dr. Kargounis?
Hi, Sandra.
Hi.
If we just take a page out of the exercise nutrition book handout, you have this concept where you in order to increase your performance, you have to cause a stimulus to you, and it's normally an insult, right? Now, you need sugar to perform, just like the brain, the muscles need it. And one way of increasing this efficiency and utilization of the sugar is to stress it without sugar. So you go and run in a fasted state. And the outcome there, what they've shown, is that you increase mitochondrial biogenesis and function and efficacy of the mitochondria. Do you think this could be applied to a cognitive environment where you can have extremely difficult tasks? If you skip breakfast, for instance, you go to school, you're having to deal with this stressor. You don't have the right glucose capacity, but you still need the glucose to enter the brain to make the brain function. So maybe then you could increase I saw you have GLUT1, GLUT3, that capacity, the function of those to then get the sugar into the brain. And then when you actually need to perform at a high level, you take your
You're
sugar,
even
and now
better,
you
yeah.
have the best of both worlds. Could this be applicable here?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting concept. I think we need to. I think from the data we have in general about fasting and cognitive performance, it doesn't seem to be the case. But we haven't looked at this specifically in terms of the kind of potential upregulation, downregulation of glucose receptors. I mean, when we look at it from a kind of neurotransmitter perspective, obviously then this makes perfect sense because we have these adaptation processes and then can potentially increase the efficacy of glucose. But I don't know. I think.
Because this takes on to the next question, which is if you're performing a clinical trial and you want to look at the impact of breakfast skipping, if you take habitual breakfast skippers, they've possibly got an adaptive response where they're no longer impacted by breakfast skipping, right? So if you put them into a clinical trial and you say, right, breakfast skipping versus none, and you make them have breakfast versus none, you're potentially not going to get any difference. And the same goes for if you take a breakfast consumer and you say, let me look at what happens if you skip breakfast. They're going to be paralyzed in essence because they give me half an hour delayed breakfast, I can't cope. So I think this is, how do you take that into account in your clinical trial?
I think at the
design?
moment, like I mentioned before, you need to really distinguish between habitual and non-habitual breakfast eaters. And then if you want to have them all in your sample, make sure you control for that as a factor, or recruit accordingly, have your exclusion criteria accordingly, and say we're only taking people who are breakfast consumers and non-breakfast consumers. It's likely, because I mean we know it from the caffeine literature, we know it from the nicotine literature, that this will make an effect, but I don't think there's sufficient evidence as yet how strong the effect is.
Dr. Ford, and then Dr. Salazar.
I just have a follow-on question to that question again then. So it's quite interesting because being satiated, you're quite compromised when you're satiated in terms of executive function or ability to think, for example. It's not necessarily a good state to be in. Certainly from an evolutionary standpoint, you'd have to lie down somewhere if you've eaten a large meal, and we have our post-meal effects when we have our conference lunches and then everybody comes back and falls asleep. I'm also thinking specifically of people, for example, the morning of an exam or the morning of a big talk at an NNI event like this. People often skip breakfast because they find that they're sharper and that they're more cognitively aware, or that they're better executive function. So in terms of breakfast skipping, it also seems that it may actually confer some kind of an advantage as opposed to a disadvantage in many aspects.
Yeah, I think that the issue we're dealing with is that the effects are inverted U-shaped. So if we go the situation you said, exam, talk, stress, anxious, cortisol, adrenaline, blood glucose levels rise, it's a natural response in a way, and a very clever response of our body to say, well, I don't want breakfast because my blood glucose levels are already high enough, thank you very much. So it's not about saying, oh, glucose in general is good, it's an inverted U-shape, and that's also what you find in terms of the, after lunch you feel just very sluggish. I mean, there are loads of effects, how it affects different neurotransmitter systems, the food that might affect different neurotransmitter systems, serotonin and so on. But again, in terms of cognitive performance, if we just look merely at glucose, it's an inverted U-shape, so there can be too much of a good thing.
Jovi. And then Dr. Andre.
Sandra, thank you for the lecture. I now have a better understanding of glycemic index and cognitive performance, or whether this is going to be low glycemic index or a high glycemic index meal. It affects certain cognitive function domains. I was just wondering, though, if there is going to be a difference with regards to the gender, or is it just going to be the same, whether these are male or female genders?
I think we don't have enough data at the moment, but there might be some gender effects. So we find that particularly in children, for example, it was the girls that were more affected than the boys. I wouldn't want to say at this stage that this is, something that's written in stone, but we need further research to look at gender effects, like you said, and we need to control for gender effects and look at these effects as well, and perhaps come up with an explanation why one gender might be more susceptible than the other. But yeah, you're right, there's some suggestion that this might be the case.
Dr. Andrea.
So it's for me now, the take out of message is like, it's also basically a question. When I think about industries or companies who make a claim, even improve cognitive performance or mental performance, I just think we go really, this is a dangerous path. And the question is, should we do that at all? Looking at the problems in methodology, in diversity of different cognitive performance tests, I just think it's quite dangerous to just claim or make such a claim. What is your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, EFSA is quite critical, so yeah, it's hard, it's hard to get past and make these claims. I would say that in terms of carbohydrates, glucose, glycemic response, the best we can say at the moment, I wouldn't talk about, and I said that repeatedly, it's not improvement, it's sustaining performance. And I think this can be seen as an improvement. If normally at 11 o'clock I'd be half asleep and I wouldn't, remember anything, then obviously it's an improvement to something over where if I do remember, if I can pay attention. But I think it's about sustaining performance, potentially, with these interventions. We need much more data in order to be able to make these claims. But it's about sustaining performance. And that's the same when we look at the effects it might have across the lifespan. Then we're not saying we're creating superhumans who are, who know everything. It's about making sure that as we age, our cognitive performance stays up there and doesn't decline. It's about that.
Any more questions? Dr. Salvador and then Dr. Agdepa. Ladies first. Okay, men first.
Thank you. Well, it's a little bit more an idea on what's going on with this part of the arousal that has not been properly studied, and I think it's something that happens really early, with babies crying and feeding and crying and feeding and having glycemic stimuli, and that will have I'm pretty certain, all us pediatricians will know this, that bottle feeding and breastfeeding are completely different responses in terms of arousal for babies and for later on activity and concentration. You can see breastfed babies that are a lot more, concentrated, less prone to tantrums and stuff like that. And I think this is a very provocative idea for further research, and not only on the glycemic index, but the whole part of food and early stimuli in the central nervous system. So thank you very much for your presentation. It's very, very nice, your work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that very substantial presentation. As nutritionists, it's so complicated for me to really implement. A while ago, you have to take note of carbohydrates, of proteins, and so on. Now comes this issue on having a low glycemic index. So was there any study having or putting in one meal different low glycemic index foods and try to take a look on its effect on cognition? Meaning to say, in one meal, one breakfast meal, different mix of low glycemic index food, then in another group or so, another type or a mix of low glycemic index food, and then try to look at its effect on cognition.
Not that I'm aware of. No, I think at the moment we're still at the stage of trying to disentangle the potential differences between high and low glycemic. I think the next stage then would be, once we identify that a low glycemic breakfast, for example, is good, to look at, okay, what let's go a step further and see what constitutes this ideal low glycemic index breakfast. So, but at the moment, I'm not aware of any study that has done that. Yeah?
Any more questions? Still have 5 minutes, or do you want to? Okay, Andrew.
In one of your slides, you showed us that there is some neuroenergetic feedback with regards to the glycemic index also. Is there a role for telling mothers to our patients, particularly those who have ADHD, for low glycemic index as part of the management and treatment of these kinds of patients?
I mean, there has been a lot of, I think going back to the 80s, 90s, there was a lot of these research questions regarding sugar, ADHD, attention hyperactivity deficit disorder. I don't think we have any scientific proof that there is a strong relationship. You know, it doesn't cause attention hyperactivity deficit disorder. What we find in children is it might lead to a kind of increase in arousal. And so whether the child has ADHD or whether it's a normotypical child, you might want to consider keeping the sugar intake low, or these spikes in sugar intake, because obviously it might increase the activation. But certainly at this stage, we can't make, and it would be wrong to make any nutritional recommendations in that area. Yeah.
Okay, I think this has been a very equally enriching session. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Sandra, for that and for all the questions.
Thank you.